Hello and welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black, here to give you all the context you need to totally rock this week's Kavami readings. This week, our assigned chapters are Joseph Smith, Matthew chapter 1. Don't worry, I'll make sure you know all about that. Regular Matthew chapters 24 and 25, Mark chapters 12 and 13, and Luke chapter 21. So we're not doing John this week, but we do have the other Gospels, as well as this very interesting Joseph Smith Matthew that I will get you all confident on. My purpose here is to make sure that as you read, you don't have to worry so much about comprehension and what's happening and where are we, and instead you can focus on the best part, which is just aligning yourself with the Spirit, listening to those little promptings, see what your mind is being drawn towards, writing down your little notes that come to your mind. It's the best part of scripture study, and I would love to free up some time of your comprehension so that you can then focus on the stuff that matters most, right? All right, this is our second week into the Holy Week. There are so many scriptures about the Holy Week. That's why it takes a long time to get through. I know sometimes we're like, Holy Week, we study that just in a week before Easter. But when we look at the four Gospels, it's almost a third of some of the books that cover events of the Holy Week. So that's why we're taking so much of our time. We've spent 6 months in the four Gospels, and that's how long it takes us to get through them. And to spend 6 weeks at the end, about a month and a half at the end here, now diving into the last week of Jesus's life. There's just so much stuff. Last week we focused on Palm Sunday. That's like the first day of the week. We focused on Monday, which is Jesus cleansing the temple and cursing a fig tree. Not much for Monday that we know about. Even Sunday is like just basically the triumphal entry. And then Tuesday, we started Tuesday. Remember, when you think Tuesday of Holy Week, think teaching. Jesus taught a lot on Tuesday. And so last week, we just like dipped our toes into Jesus's teaching. We focused on the Pharisees are kind of arguing with him, trying to ask questions to trip him up and get Jesus to say weird things. They're asking about taxes and marriage and all these things. And Jesus is answering their questions. And he taught a few parables as well. This week, we're wrapping up Tuesday. That is it. Our entire focus is on the rest of the chapters that cover Tuesday and the teachings that Jesus taught on Tuesday. However, it divides pretty nicely because Jesus at this point takes his disciples onto a place called the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives was a mountain right there, and they go onto that mountainside, and Jesus teaches them in response to their questions about the second coming. Lots of teachings about the second coming. We're talking prophecies about what will happen the second coming, parables that kind of give us insight into the second coming, warnings, beautiful things that will happen in the second coming. This week is really focused on the second coming, and the teachings that Jesus gives there are often referred to just in common language as the Olivet Discourse. So maybe you've heard that before, or maybe you'll hear that this week. If someone is talking about the Olivet Discourse, that is a teaching that Jesus gave on Tuesday of Holy Week on the Mount of Olives with his disciples, his apostles, as the audience for who he was teaching. And the focus is, like the subject of the Olivet Discourse is the second coming. Okay, so that is almost all of what we will be studying this week is the Olivet Discourse with Matthew, Mark, and Luke's interpretations of it. Okay, now let's get to the elephant in the room. Joseph Smith, Matthew 1. What is this? Okay, to make sure you feel confident on this, real quick, I want to give you a quick reminder of what Joseph Smith translations are. So Joseph Smith, after he translated the Book of Mormon, the very next thing that he did is he read the entire Bible, King James Version, from cover to cover. And as he was reading it, he would stop and pray and ask God if there was anything that needed to be changed or added to the Bible. We know that plain and precious truths, goodness, have been taken out of the Bible over the years. And so that's what Joseph Smith was trying to add back in, asking for revelation as he went through and adding in or changing or doing whatever he felt inspired to do with the entire Bible. This took a super long time, by the way, months and months and months of really hard work. He had scribes helping him. It was a whole ordeal. We focus on that during Doctrine and Covenants here. But that is where all of those little Joseph Smith translation footnotes come from, as you've been reading the New Testament and the Old Testament last year. When we see little footnotes at the bottom that have like a little phrase that's just being changed, that's because Joseph Smith felt inspired to add that change. Now, you also know that in the back, there's an index of Joseph Smith translations that are longer, right? We've talked about these before. Though it just means that there was like a chunk of text where Joseph Smith had so many things to add in and change that it didn't logically make sense to add like 50 footnotes to one verse. And so instead they're pulled out in an index where the changes are written into the actual text. And so we've looked at those before. When there's Joseph Smith translations in the index, it just means there's a lot of them. And so they've been pulled out separately. Joseph Smith, Matthew 1, is the Joseph Smith translation for Matthew chapter 24, plus the last verse of Matthew chapter 23, which really messes up, right? Verse 1 is actually the last verse in Matthew chapter 23. Verse 2 is then the first verse in Matthew chapter 24. But just for ease of talking about it right now, let's just say it is the Joseph Smith translation for all of Matthew chapter 24. Okay, now, where is it? If you are using your app or on the Gospel Library app, you can just click on Joseph Smith Matthew 1 and it takes you to it, right? But if you have a physical copy of the New Testament, and this is what I have, if you're looking through it, there is no Joseph Smith Matthew 1. It is not in your New Testament. It is in the Pearl of Great Price. It is in the Pearl of Great Price. And so you will have to find your quad and pull out your scriptures for that, or just use your app to study this chapter in particular. Now, the reason why it's in the Pearl of Great Price is a story for another day that I'm not going to spend too much time on here. But basically, the Pearl of Great Price has its origins in early missionaries who were going to England. And they wanted to bring a pamphlet, in addition to the Book of Mormon, they wanted to bring a pamphlet of documents and declarations and stories and other things that would kind of help give the saints in England who are being converted some context as to what was going on in the Restoration. And so one thing that they chose was, hey, let's pull out the Joseph Smith's Matthew 24. And they put that in the Pearl of Great Price. And it's just Joseph Smith Matthew 1 is what it's called in the Pearl of Great Price, just to show this is how Joseph Smith has been adding receiving revelation to know how to change the New Testament. So it was like an example to the saints in England of what Joseph Smith was doing with his translations of the Bible, in addition to the Book of Mormon that they also had, right? So that's the origins of the entire Pearl of Great Price. So basically what we need to know for our sake this week is the Pearl of Great Price, since it pulled out all of those Joseph Smith translations, when you read Matthew 24 in your normal New Testament, there are no Joseph Smith translations in it because they've all been pulled out into Joseph Smith Matthew 1. It's as if they were all pulled out into the index, except that index just happens to be in the Pearl of Great Price instead of at the back of your New Testament, okay? Hopefully this is all making sense. So basically, you're going to want to read Matthew chapter 24 and Joseph Smith Matthew 1 at the same time, because it's just like reading an original chunk of text with a translated chunk of text that Joseph Smith provided in the index, something like that. And then you can see in Joseph Smith's Matthew, you can see the little tweaks and changes that he made as comparable to Matthew 24. Okay? Making sense here? Hopefully that at least gives you confidence to know what to study. Study them at the same time, or study them however you have felt best to study Joseph Smith translations. Read them one after each other or at the same time, whatever works for you. But they are the same exact thing. It's just Joseph Smith has added his revelations from God about what needs to be added in and changed and tweaked and switched around and all that stuff that we're used to seeing in the footnotes or maybe pulled out in an index. Okay, we good? All right, let's talk about the individual chapters then. Like I said, it's kind of easy as for content this week because it's almost all the Olivet Discourse and teachings about the second coming. So let's start first with what happens in Matthew chapter 24, and which is the same as Joseph Smith Matthew 1. So these are the same things. This starts with the first half of the Olivet Discourse. That's what it is. So we see Jesus taking his disciples to the Mountain of Olives, and he is teaching them. He's giving them a lot of signs about what to look for when it comes to the second coming. A lot of not so great signs like wars and destruction, but then also some awesome signs like the gospel being in all the nations of the world. So kind of like you see the dichotomy of the different things. He's prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem as well. Talks about how there will be false prophets. And then he says when he comes the second time, it will not be quiet. It will not be quiet. There will be lots of attention. And only the Father knows when Jesus is coming the second time. So all of the saints need to be ready at any point in time because no one knows except God the Father. Okay, so that's what both of those chapters cover, right? It's the same, Joseph Smith, Matthew 1 and Matthew 24. Okay, now we go on to our second chapter in regular Matthew, Matthew chapter 25. Now you'll see the footnotes be added back in if there's any Joseph Smith translations here. This is now the second half of Jesus's Olivet Discourse. We get parables. We get the parable of the 10 virgins, which is one of the best parables about the second coming that we have. We also have the parable of the talents. This is where different servants are given different amounts of talents, and we see what they do with their stewardship over those talents. And we also get the parable of the sheep and the goats. And then Jesus ends Matthew 25 with some very famous verses about when we serve other people, we are actually in the service of our God. Love those verses. Okay, let's go to Mark. Mark, we have 2 chapters this week, 12 and 13. Mark 12 actually fits more with last week. I think there were just so many chapters last week that they couldn't give us another one. But Mark 12 covers the teachings of Jesus on Tuesday still, but it aligns more with what we talked about last week. So you'll see Jesus with the Pharisees questioning him, Jesus teaching about taxes and marriage and going through all the same teachings that we talked about. He gives the parable of the wicked husbandmen. He talks about hypocrisy, but then at the end of Mark chapter 12, we get a beautiful story about a widow who goes to the temple and she tosses in her 2 mites, and Jesus teaches about how she has given more than they have because she sacrificed out of her want instead of her excess. Okay, second chapter in Mark, Mark 13. This now totally aligns with this week, and it has the Olivet Discourse in its entirety, according to Mark. So we're seeing a lot of the same things we read in Matthew. We're seeing Jesus talk about the signs of the second coming, both the bad stuff, the destruction and the wars and the rumors of wars, and also the great stuff, the gospel being everywhere and people being aware of who Jesus is. Really cool to read. Warning about false Christs who will be there. And then Jesus, when he comes, he will come in his full glory and power. And then at the end, Jesus gives the parable of the fig tree. Okay, last thing, let's look at our 1 chapter in Luke. This is Luke chapter 21. This chapter has the entire Olivet Discourse, so we're going to see many of the same things again. Although this one starts with Jesus talking about the widow's mite, about the widow who tosses in her 2 mites. So we get that story first. And then we get these teachings of the Olivet Discourse, talking about the signs of the second coming, both the good and the not so good, all of that mixed up. And then when Jesus arrives, he will arrive in his full power and glory. He then gives the parable of the fig tree and just reminds his disciples that they need to always be ready. And he's speaking to all of us, right? We always need to be ready. No one knows. President Nelson is not keeping some secret. It is in scripture that only God the Father knows when Jesus will come again. And so at this point, we are just getting as ready as we can. And that's the best that we can do. That's what Jesus has asked us to do. Okay, that's it for the scriptures this week. Like I said, the content itself is actually fairly straightforward this week. There's great stuff to dive into, but there's not a million different things going on. It's the Olivet Discourse. It's talking about the second coming, which is so cool because very applicable stuff that we can be talking about for today. So absolutely love this. I think my personal focus question in Matthew 25, Jesus gives those very famous scriptures about serving other people. And when we serve other people, we are serving God. And so I want to focus on that this week and think about how not only can I serve more, but when I serve, I can have my intentions better aligned and thinking about how am I serving God as I clean up this mess on the floor, or as I hold your baby in church, or as I send you a little text. How am I serving God as I do that? And it's kind of cool to ponder on that. So that's what I want to focus on this week. All right, have a great week this week and happy studying.